The chronological sequence of events reached a pivotal juncture at exactly 34 minutes past 2 o'clock on an otherwise routine Tuesday afternoon in the month of March, a moment that served as the precise temporal marker when Representative Maxine Waters experienced the harrowing realization that she had executed a monumental and entirely irreversible miscalculation in her strategic political judgment. Positioned with an air of resolute composure before a large display easel within the hallowed and ornate confines of the hearing room, FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino held aloft an expansive, high-definition satellite photograph, while the sophisticated digital projection system situated directly behind his silhouette showcased a stark, uncompromising side-by-side visual comparison that effectively plunged the entire chamber into a state of profound and absolute silence. Dominating the left-hand quadrant of the illuminated screen was a breathtakingly sprawling $6 million residential estate, a property characterized by its meticulously groomed emerald lawns and towering, statuesque palm trees that swayed rhythmically in the gentle coastal California breeze, all while its intricate and gilded security gates shimmered brilliantly as they caught the golden rays of the late afternoon sun. In a jarring and deeply somber contrast, the right-hand portion of the composite image depicted seemingly endless and dilapidated rows of tattered, homeless encampments that stretched across multiple city blocks in the heart of South Los Angeles, creating a landscape where weathered blue plastic tarps and rusted, discarded shopping carts cluttered the narrow sidewalks occupied by individuals forced to survive upon the unforgiving bare pavement. Representative Waters remained physically hunched forward in her high-backed leather chair, her facial expression one of utter bewilderment, with her mouth slightly agape as she struggled internally to articulate a procedural point of order that would never actually materialize, her hand remaining suspended in the heavy air as if it had been suddenly paralyzed by the immense gravitational weight of the visual revelation. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was abruptly enveloped in a heavy, suffocating, and collective quietude, not the variety of silence born of professional respect or attentive listening, but rather a stunned and paralyzed stillness, akin to the experience of watching a catastrophic collision occur in agonizing slow motion. Approximately 52 million citizens were actively observing the proceedings through live broadcasts across various major television networks, while prominent social media platforms, such as Twitter and Reddit, experienced unprecedented surges in digital traffic, as the viral split-screen image of the opulent mansion contrasted with the makeshift tents began to circulate with lightning speed across the global landscape. In that singular and crystalline moment of clarity, every individual present within the chamber, and every viewer watching from the privacy of their home, could easily discern the grim realization written across the congresswoman's face. This was certainly not the triumphant political outcome she had so meticulously and strategically planned to achieve. This particular afternoon had been originally intended to serve as her crowning achievement, a triumphant and high-profile interrogation of a high-ranking official that would provide her with the perfect opportunity to reclaim her political narrative and solidify her enduring status as a titan of the opposition on the national stage. Instead, through a series of unexpected developments, the roles had been violently and effectively reversed, and she unexpectedly found herself the primary subject of an unfolding and detailed investigation documented with physical financial receipts, high-resolution forensic photographs, official county property deeds, and confidential bank records that were currently being broadcast to the observation of the entire world. To truly grasp the staggering magnitude of how a seasoned 32-year veteran of the United States Congress found her long and illustrious career beginning to disintegrate on live national television, one must examine the events that occurred a mere 45 minutes prior to the start of the session, a time when Maxine Waters still maintained the outward illusion of total legislative control. Chairman Jim Jordan struck the ceremonial gavel 3 distinct times, the sharp and authoritative echoes reverberating through the majestic, marble-clad chamber and bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and pillars of the historic building. He formally declared the hearing of the House Judiciary Committee to be officially in session, utilizing a voice that was practiced, firm, and entirely professional. A specific tone of authority he had mastered over many years of presiding over such high-stakes and emotionally charged legislative events. The primary stated purpose of the day's proceedings was to investigate serious allegations concerning the potential weaponization of federal law enforcement agencies and to address the growing public and legislative concerns regarding perceived FBI overreach into domestic affairs. Seated entirely alone at the witness table was Deputy Director Dan Bongino, a man who notably lacked the usual phalanx of high-priced defense attorneys, public relations specialists, or thick stacks of carefully prepared remarks that typically accompany a government witness of his high stature and influence. He sat with only a single weathered manila folder and a simple bottle of water, appearing remarkably unbothered and calm despite the immense gravity and potential consequences of the formal setting. When the chairman officially thanked him for his voluntary appearance before the committee, Bongino leaned forward into the microphone with a steady and unflappable demeanor, his voice retaining the unmistakable and gritty edge of his Queens, New York upbringing, a distinctive accent he had never sought to diminish, hide, or polish for the sake of conforming to conventional political optics. He expressed his full readiness to address any and all inquiries the committee members might have, but before the chairman could even formally recognize the first designated speaker, Maxine Waters intervened with her characteristic and well-known theatrical flair. Dressed in a sharp, vibrant, and impeccably tailored red suit that had long since become her signature sartorial style, the 75-year-old legislator leaned heavily into her microphone to prematurely reclaim her time before the actual questioning of the witness had even begun. She asserted, with an air of aggressive and unwavering confidence, that the witness would undoubtedly attempt to obstruct the formal proceedings, a provocative comment that elicited a mixture of supportive laughter from her political allies and weary, frustrated groans from her ideological opponents across the aisle. Chairman Jordan allowed the congresswoman to proceed with her remarks for a period of 5 minutes, at which point she donned her reading glasses with a dramatic flourish, looking down briefly at her prepared notes before fixing Bongino with a gaze that could only be described as intensely predatory and focused. She began her opening salvo by attempting to completely delegitimize his professional authority, labeling him as nothing more than a former media personality and a political operative whose very presence within the upper echelons of the FBI was a direct affront to the sanctity of the institution. Her voice rose in a practiced and dramatic crescendo as she accused him of spending the entirety of his career attacking progressive social movements and those individuals who possessed the courage to challenge the prevailing administration's policies. She then strategically pivoted to her first targeted line of questioning, demanding a simplistic and restrictive yes or no answer regarding whether the FBI had conducted any official investigations into social justice activists operating within the state of California. Bongino, drawing upon his experience as a former Secret Service agent accustomed to maintaining absolute composure under extreme psychological pressure, did not flinch, as he calmly explained that the Bureau is tasked with investigating suspected federal crimes, rather than the personal ideologies or constitutionally protected speech of citizens. He then pointedly mentioned a specific instance where an organizer was investigated for the alleged embezzlement of millions of dollars from a charitable organization meant to provide aid to grieving families, asking rhetorically if such a serious crime should be ignored simply due to the suspect's stated political affiliations. Waters immediately dismissed his detailed response as mere deflection, a common and well-worn tactic in her extensive political playbook, and continued her personal and pointed assault on his professional credibility and character. She attempted to paint him as a biased and partisan mouthpiece for specific interests, utilizing the exact same aggressive strategy she had used successfully against countless banking executives and high-ranking administration officials in the years past. Her singular goal was to provoke an emotional and defensive reaction that would make the witness appear guilty or unstable to the viewing public, but she quickly discovered that Dan Bongino was not an easy target to unsettle or intimidate through rhetorical pressure. In a startling and unexpected turn of events, Bongino conceded that he did indeed hold strong personal opinions, but he then skillfully and rapidly reversed the direction of the entire interrogation. By asking Waters exactly how many days out of the calendar year she actually spent residing within the specific borders of the district she was elected to represent. The room fell into a heavy and expectant silence as the congresswoman realized, perhaps too late, that she had walked directly into a sophisticated trap of her own making. She loudly protested that she was the one designated to ask the questions in this forum, but the deputy director maintained with steady logic that since his own credibility and fitness for office had been publicly challenged, it was only appropriate to examine her own standing in the interest of total public transparency. Chairman Jordan formally yielded the floor to Bongino, who then moved with purpose toward an easel to reveal a series of detailed and data-heavy poster boards that had been previously hidden from the committee's view. He displayed a detailed map of California's 43rd congressional district, which was overlaid with sobering and tragic statistics regarding the median household income, rising poverty levels, and the staggering number of homeless residents, the very people Waters had represented for more than 3 decades. He then unveiled the second board, which clearly listed the specific street address and multi-million-dollar market value of a luxury estate located in Hancock Park, a residence that was situated in an entirely different and separate congressional district from her own. Bongino pointed out the profound and disturbing disconnect between the daily struggles of the constituents Waters represented and the opulent, insulated lifestyle she enjoyed in a wealthy enclave elsewhere. Waters attempted to forcibly halt this line of questioning, characterizing it as a blatant attempt at character assassination, but Bongino remained entirely unfazed, citing verifiable public records and the congresswoman's own filed financial disclosures as irrefutable proof of his claims. He then delved into her historical and complex connection with One United Bank and the highly controversial TARP bailout that took place during the 2008 global financial crisis, highlighting how her family's private financial interests appeared to coincide perfectly with her official legislative actions. The deputy director presented a meticulous and chronological timeline of events, illustrating how Waters had personally facilitated meetings between senior Treasury officials and bank executives, at a time when her husband held significant equity in the failing financial institution. He noted that while the House Ethics Committee had technically cleared her of wrongdoing by placing the ultimate blame on her grandson and chief of staff, the consistent pattern of such behavior was becoming increasingly difficult for any objective observer to ignore. He further detailed several other specific instances over the following years, where her committee votes and sponsored pieces of legislation appeared to provide direct and measurable benefits to financial institutions in which her family members had vested financial interests. As the weight of the evidence continued to mount, the congresswoman's usual air of confidence evaporated, replaced by a visible and growing sense of panic as she began to confer frantically with her circle of aides. Republican committee members then pressed Bongino on whether such recurring patterns of behavior warranted further federal investigation, to which he responded that while he could not provide comments on active or potential cases, such financial anomalies would typically trigger a much closer look by law enforcement for any ordinary American citizen. Waters made one final and desperate attempt to frame the entire situation as a racially motivated and biased smear campaign. But Bongino met this serious accusation with a powerful, calm, and deeply personal rebuttal. He spoke movingly of his own working-class background and his long career of investigating public corruption, regardless of a politician's specific race or party affiliation, asserting that the constituents of South Los Angeles deserved a representative whose primary focus was their economic well-being rather than personal enrichment. The hearing eventually descended into a state of procedural chaos, leading to an immediate recess, but the damage to Waters' professional reputation was already viewed as irreparable as the evidence continued to circulate through every major media outlet and reached the very streets of her own district. The atmosphere in the hearing room grew increasingly heavy as Deputy Director Bongino reached once more into his manila folder, retrieving a document that seemed to pulsate with the heavy weight of forgotten history. He turned his full attention toward the specific and intricate details of the One United Bank matter, a controversy that Waters had long considered to be a safely buried relic of her political past. Bongino articulated with clinical and prosecutorial precision how, during the absolute height of the 2008 global financial meltdown, that specific institution was teetering on the edge of total insolvency, while the congresswoman's husband, Sidney Williams, served on its board of directors and held substantial personal equity in the firm. The deputy director highlighted the extraordinary and highly unusual nature of a meeting arranged by Waters' office between senior Treasury Department officials and the bank's executive leadership, a high-level privilege that was, notably, not extended to other struggling community banks, a similar size or demographic. As he laid out the chronological timeline, it became increasingly apparent that shortly after this high-level intervention, the bank received $12 million in taxpayer-funded TARP bailouts, an influx of capital that effectively stabilized the institution and protected her husband's private investment from a total financial loss. Bongino then strategically juxtaposed this institutional rescue with the personal financial activities and investments of the Waters household during that same volatile period of history. He revealed that while the 43rd District was being decimated by record numbers of foreclosures and rapidly rising unemployment rates, Waters had simultaneously engaged in a series of lucrative real estate acquisitions worth nearly $2 million, often utilizing significant cash reserves or minimal external financing. This stark and disturbing contrast between the intense suffering of her constituents and her own personal accumulation of significant wealth created an undeniable tension within the room, forcing all those present to seriously question the ethical boundaries of her legislative influence. Although Waters countered this by citing a previous ethics investigation that had technically cleared her by shifting the responsibility to her grandson, Bongino argued that the close proximity of the financial benefits to her personal estate suggested a much deeper and more systemic issue than a mere administrative or staff oversight. The narrative then shifted from a single, isolated event to a much broader and more comprehensive examination of what Bongino characterized as a persistent pattern of convenient outcomes. He presented data-driven evidence illustrating several distinct instances over the following decade, where Waters' work on the Financial Services Committee seemed to align with remarkable perfection with her family's private financial portfolio and investment goals. In the year 2014, for example, she had cast a pivotal and influential vote against the imposition of more stringent oversight requirements on a specific class of community banks that happened to include institutions where her husband held significant investments. Following the successful defeat of these proposed regulations, her subsequent mandatory financial disclosures reflected a significant and measurable appreciation in the market value of those specific family assets. Bongino then pointed to a 2019 legislative push for specific tax breaks designed for small financial institutions, an event which occurred just a few months after another substantial and timely investment by her husband in that exact financial sector. He argued that while each individual vote could perhaps be defended in isolation as standard policy advocacy, the cumulative and recurring effect of these coincidences suggested that the reclaiming of time Waters so frequently demanded was often used to protect the very financial structures that enriched her own household. The entire room remained in a state of stunned silence as the deputy director asked a final rhetorical question regarding whether any other public official would be granted such a consistent benefit of the doubt if their private wealth consistently mirrored their public policy decisions in such a direct and highly profitable manner. The most devastating moment of the entire afternoon arrived when Bongino utilized the committee's high-definition display system to present vivid footage he had personally commissioned using his own private funds rather than government resources. The large screens came alive with sweeping, professional-grade drone shots that took the silent audience on a somber and eye-opening tour of California's 43rd District. The camera hovered low over the sprawling and crowded tent cities of South Los Angeles, capturing the raw, unvarnished, and heartbreaking reality of thousands of people living under blue plastic tarps amidst piles of refuse and long-abandoned storefronts. The visceral sensory details, the deeply cracked pavement, the boarded-up local businesses, and the weary, hopeless faces of the residents were presented with a somber dignity that made the apparent neglect impossible for any viewer to ignore. Then, with a sudden and jarring visual transition, the footage shifted abruptly to the gated Hancock Park estate where Waters actually maintained her primary residence. The audience was greeted by the sight of a pristine, $6 million mansion, complete with lush green landscaping, high-tech security fortifications, and the quiet, undisturbed serenity of an elite neighborhood located miles away from the boundaries of the district she officially represented. Bongino provided a somber and measured narration to the video, noting that his team of investigators had spoken with hundreds of actual residents in South Los Angeles, the vast majority of whom reported that they had never once seen their congresswoman in their neighborhoods outside of highly controlled and staged media events. This overwhelming visual evidence effectively dismantled the carefully constructed and long-maintained image of Waters as a champion of the streets, replacing it with the stark reality of a career politician who lived in a world entirely insulated from the consequences of the very policies she championed. As the weight of the evidence became truly overwhelming, Waters resorted to a familiar and well-worn political defense, accusing the deputy director of utilizing his high position to harass and intimidate a prominent woman of color. She framed the entire investigation as a racially motivated assault on her character and a broader, coordinated attempt by the current administration to silence influential progressive voices. The room held its collective breath as she delivered what many consider the nuclear option of political rhetoric, hoping it would once again stifle the inquiry as it had successfully done many times throughout her long career. However, Bongino's response was entirely unexpected in its sheer intensity and deep personal conviction. He rose slowly from his seat and spoke with a quiet but firm authority, drawing specifically upon his own history as a working-class New Yorker and a lifelong public servant who had protected leaders from all political backgrounds. He firmly rejected the notion that race or gender should ever serve as a protective shield for financial impropriety, or the persistent neglect of one's own constituents. His voice took on a sharper and more resonant edge as he asserted that the people of her district, many of whom were people of color themselves, deserved far better than a representative who had seemingly built a personal financial empire on the foundations of their continued poverty and a struggle. He argued with passion that true justice was not to be found in the performance of identity politics, but rather in the equitable application of the law and the genuine, heartfelt representation of those citizens who had entrusted her with their votes for 32 consecutive years. Following the formal recess, the digital world experienced a massive and seismic shift as the video clips of the hearing went viral, with a speed that completely defied traditional media cycles and gatekeepers. The split-screen image of the multi-million-dollar mansion contrasted with the homeless encampments became the defining and iconic visual of the year, sparking intense and heated debates across all sectors of the political spectrum. While some traditional media outlets attempted to focus their coverage on the aggressive and assertive nature of the deputy director's delivery, the sheer volume of public records and visual proof made it increasingly difficult for anyone to dismiss the substance of the revelations. More importantly, the reaction within the actual community of South Los Angeles was one of profound and deep betrayal. Local social media groups and community forums were suddenly flooded with messages from longtime supporters who felt that the veil of political performance had finally and permanently been lifted. They began to painfully reconcile their decades of personal loyalty with the reality of their stagnant and decaying surroundings and the congresswoman's rapidly rising personal net worth. The sentiment on the ground shifted rapidly from defensive support to a loud demand for accountability as residents began to realize that the resistance Waters so often spoke of did not seem to include a resistance to the poverty and urban decay within their own specific zip codes. The subsequent political fallout was swift, decisive, and merciless. Within only a few days, the House Ethics Committee announced the opening of a formal inquiry into the financial disclosures and potential conflicts of interest that had been highlighted so vividly during the hearing. The Democratic leadership, sensing a major shift in the political winds and fearing a significant backlash from their own voter base, quietly began to pressure Waters to step down from her most influential committee positions. A historic and rare House resolution followed, where a significant and surprising number of her own colleagues joined the opposition to officially remove her from the Financial Services Committee, a move that effectively stripped her of the legislative power she had spent decades accumulating. In the power vacuum left by her rapidly diminishing influence, a new and different generation of local leadership began to emerge from the community. Marcus Williams, a young and energetic community organizer who had spent his entire life working on the very streets shown in the drone footage, launched a primary challenge that focused heavily on the themes of consistent local presence and total fiscal transparency. His grassroots campaign, funded primarily by small-dollar donations from the actual residents of the 43rd District, represented a fundamental and widespread rejection of the celebrity politician model of governance. He spoke frequently of the urgent need for a representative who actually lived where they worked, and who viewed the concept of public service as a sacred duty rather than a lucrative business opportunity. A full year after the explosive and historical hearing, the general landscape of American politics looked subtly but significantly different than before. The events of March 17th served as a potent and enduring reminder that the tools of modern transparency can cut in both political directions. While Maxine Waters remained in her congressional office, her role within the party and the country had been reduced to that of a cautionary tale, a stark warning of the dangers of political hubris and the inevitable consequences of the wide gap between rhetoric and reality. The hearing had successfully forced a long-overdue national conversation about the ethics of legal corruption and the moral responsibility of those individuals who represent the most vulnerable members of society. Dan Bongino continued his professional work at the FBI, maintaining throughout that the exposure was never about a personal vendetta or partisan goal, but rather about protecting the integrity of the system itself. The iconic story of the mansion and the tents remained a permanent and haunting fixture in the public consciousness, a symbol of the exact moment when the curtain was pulled back, and the true nature of career politics was revealed for all to see. In the 43rd District, the local people had finally stopped looking toward Washington for a distant hero, and instead started looking toward each other, realizing that real and lasting change begins not with a loud voice in a distant committee room, but with a representative who actually calls their community home.